The Galactic Council had been watching Earth for nearly 100 years before they decided to make contact. Their observation stations floated in the darkness beyond Neptune, recording every television broadcast, every radio signal, and every piece of data that escaped from the little blue planet. Teams of alien analysts spent their lives studying humanity, trying to understand what kind of species they were dealing with. The problem was that most of these analysts came from herbivorous species. They were gentle beings who evolved from something like grazing animals. They were descended from creatures that ate only fruit and leaves. They had never known violence in their entire evolutionary history. These were the species that dominated the Galactic Council, and they looked at humanity through eyes that had never understood hunting. Was the senior interpreter assigned to the Earth Project? He was a tall creature with compound eyes and clicking mandibles that served as his mouth. He had spent 40 years studying human culture, and he believed he understood them completely. "Humans are a species in deep conflict," announced at the council assembly. His voice was translated by a small device embedded in his throat, turning his clicks and chirps into words that all species could understand. They are ashamed of their predatory nature. They hide from it. They deny it. He presented his evidence on a massive holographic display. Images of Earth appeared, showing factory farms hidden behind windowless walls, grocery stores where meat came wrapped in plastic, completely separated from any sign that it had once been alive, restaurants where the kitchen was hidden from view, where the act of cooking flesh was performed in secret. "Look at their entertainment," continued. "They make stories about people who refuse to eat meat. They create entire movements dedicated to ending the consumption of animal flesh. They feel guilt. They feel shame. They argue among themselves about whether eating meat is moral." The council members nodded their various heads and appendages. This made sense to them. Of course, a species would feel bad about killing other creatures. Of course, they would try to evolve past such barbaric behavior. "Our recommendation is to treat humans gently," concluded. "They are a traumatized species, still recovering from their violent past. We should not remind them of their predatory nature. It would be cruel." This interpretation became official policy. When human ships finally crossed into galactic space, when ambassadors were exchanged and treaties were signed, the alien species treated humanity with careful sensitivity. They avoided any mention of hunting or meat-eating. They assumed that humans were embarrassed by these things. They had made a terrible mistake. Aboard the human diplomatic vessel Endurance, life continued as it always had. The ship carried 50 crew members on a 6-month mission to establish trade relations with various alien species. They had engineers and scientists and diplomats and security officers. And they had Danny Vega. Danny was 34 years old, born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He had learned to cook from his grandmother, who had learned from her grandmother, who had learned from generations stretching back further than anyone could remember. Cooking was in his blood the way some people had music or art in theirs. It was not just what he did. It was who he was. He ran the Endurance's kitchen with the precision of a military operation and the passion of an artist. Every meal was an opportunity. Every ingredient was a possibility. He woke up at 4 in the morning to start preparing breakfast, and he often did not sleep until midnight after finishing the next day's preparations. The crew loved him, not just because his food was extraordinary, but because he genuinely cared about every single person he fed. He remembered that Lieutenant Commander was allergic to shellfish. He knew that Ensign Park preferred his eggs scrambled soft, not hard. He understood that Chief Engineer Maria needed extra protein on days when she was working double shifts. "Food is love," Danny often said. "When you cook for someone, you're taking care of them. You're telling them they matter." He had no idea that half the galaxy considered his profession to be evidence of psychological damage. He had no idea that alien diplomats spoke about human chefs in hushed, sympathetic tones, the way one might speak about someone recovering from a terrible addiction. To Danny, cooking meat was simply part of being human. It was tradition and culture and family and joy all mixed together. The misunderstanding ran deep on both sides. When the Endurance docked at alien stations, the crew noticed that their hosts seemed uncomfortable discussing food. They assumed this was just cultural difference. When alien diplomats carefully avoided mentioning anything related to hunting or animals, the humans thought they were simply being polite about topics that might not translate well between species. Nobody realized that the aliens were trying to protect human feelings. Nobody realized that the entire galactic community had constructed an elaborate fiction about humanity being a fragile species that could not handle reminders of their carnivorous past. Ambassador Price was an experienced diplomat who had spent 20 years negotiating difficult agreements on Earth before being selected for the Endurance mission. She was smart and patient and skilled at reading people, but even she did not see what was happening. The aliens were too good at hiding their assumptions, and the humans were too focused on establishing trade relationships to notice the strange gaps in conversation. Danny Vega spent his days completely unaware of any of this. He cooked breakfast and lunch and dinner. He experimented with alien ingredients when he could get them, trying to understand how they might work with Earth flavors. He traded recipes with alien cooks who seemed confused by his enthusiasm but appreciated his skill. He was particularly proud of a dish he had developed using a vegetable from the. It had a bitter taste that most humans found unpleasant, but Danny had discovered that roasting it with certain spices transformed it into something wonderful. He served it alongside grilled chicken, and the crew declared it one of the best meals they had ever eaten. Danny did not know that news of this meal had spread to the diplomatic corps. He did not know that they had discussed it in worried tones, concerned about the psychological implications of a human who seemed to celebrate the cooking of animal flesh rather than hiding it in shame. Perhaps this one has not yet begun his healing journey, one official suggested. We should be patient with them, another agreed. They cannot help what they are. The misunderstanding continued to grow, building towards something that nobody could have predicted. The galaxy thought it understood humanity. The galaxy was wrong, and soon everyone would learn just how wrong they had been. Danny Vega finished his shift that night and went to bed early. Tomorrow the Endurance would arrive at Station Omega 7, where they would meet with a species called the. He had heard they were difficult to negotiate with, but he was not worried. His job was just to keep the crew fed and happy. The diplomats could handle the rest. He had no idea that tomorrow would change everything. Station Omega 7 floated in the darkness between two star systems, a massive structure built from metal and glass and materials that humans did not yet have names for. It served as neutral ground for species that did not trust each other enough to meet on home territory. Hundreds of different beings walked its corridors every day, conducting business and diplomacy, and sometimes things that were not quite legal. The Endurance docked at Bay 17, and Ambassador Price led her team through the decontamination procedures. Danny Vega was not supposed to be part of the diplomatic group. He was supposed to stay on the ship and prepare for the celebratory dinner that would follow successful negotiations. But the station's market had ingredients he could not find anywhere else, and he had received permission to go shopping while the diplomats worked. He walked through the station with a list in one hand and a translation device in the other. The market was overwhelming. Vendors from dozens of species sold things he could not identify, strange fruits in colors that hurt his eyes, meats from animals he had never heard of, spices that smelled like nothing on Earth. Danny loved every second of it. He was examining a jar of something that looked like purple honey when his communication device buzzed. It was a message from Lieutenant Commander, who was part of the security team assigned to protect the ambassador. Chef, we might have a situation. Can you come to negotiation chamber 12? Don't ask questions, just come. Danny frowned at the message. He was a cook, not a diplomat or a soldier, but was not the type to ask for help without a good reason. He put down the purple honey and made his way through the station's winding corridors. The negotiation chamber was a large room with high ceilings and a circular table in the center. When Danny arrived, he found the human delegation standing on one side of the room, looking tense. On the other side stood the Danny had never seen a before, and his first thought was that they looked like something from a nightmare. They were 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and skin covered in dark green scales. Their faces were flat and wide, with mouths full of teeth that looked designed for tearing flesh. Their eyes were yellow with vertical pupils, like a snake or a cat. There were 6 of them, and they radiated danger the way a fire radiates heat. Every movement they made seemed designed to remind everyone in the room that they were predators. The leader was a massive creature named. He stood at the front of his group, his 4 arms crossed over his broad chest. His voice was deep and rumbling, like thunder in the distance. "We have heard interesting things about humanity," was saying as Danny entered. "We have heard that your species has lost its edge, that you have become soft, that you feel shame about what you truly are." Ambassador Price kept her expression neutral. "I'm not sure where you heard such things, but I assure you that humanity is quite capable of defending itself." Made a sound that might have been laughter. "Words are easy, actions are truth." He gestured to his hunters, and 2 of them left the room. They returned moments later, dragging something behind them. It was a creature the size of a large bear, but it looked nothing like any Earth animal. Its body was covered in armored plates that gleamed like metal. 6 legs ended in claws that could tear through steel. Its head was mostly mouth, filled with rows of teeth that seemed to go back forever. Even though it was bound in chains and muzzled, it thrashed and fought with terrifying strength. "This is announced with obvious pride, "the most dangerous predator in 3 star systems. My hunters captured it alive, which has only been accomplished 4 times in recorded history. 3 of my warriors died in the attempt." The creature roared through its muzzle, and several members of the human delegation stepped back involuntarily. The sound was primal and terrible, designed by evolution to trigger fear in anything that heard it. Watched the human reaction with satisfaction. "We heard that your kind has forgotten what it means to face true predators. We thought we would remind you. Perhaps it will help you understand your place when we discuss trade agreements." The message was clear. There were predators. Humans were not. Any negotiation would proceed from that understanding. Ambassador Price opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Danny Vega stepped forward. He had been standing near the back of the room, still wearing his food-stained apron, still carrying his shopping bag. Now he walked past the diplomats and security officers, approaching the bound creature with obvious curiosity. He asked, circling the beast slowly. It turned its head to track him, growling deep in its throat. Danny did not seem concerned. "I've read about these. The xenobiology reports mentioned them. High fat content in the muscle tissue, right? Dense bone structure." The room went silent. The humans stared at him, even the seemed confused. His yellow eyes narrowed. "You know of the..." "Just what I read in the scientific databases. Fascinating creatures." Danny crouched down to look at the beast more closely, staying just outside the range of its claws. "The report said the meat has an unusual protein structure. Something about the way the muscles store energy for those explosive attacks. How do you usually prepare them?" Took a step back. This was not the reaction he had expected. This small human with soft hands and a dirty apron was not supposed to be curious. He was supposed to be afraid. "Prepare them," repeated. "For eating," Danny clarified. "I mean, you did hunt it. You're not just going to waste it, are you? That would be disrespectful to the animal and to the hunters who died catching it." One of the hunters made a choking sound. Ambassador Price covered her mouth to hide what might have been a smile. Lieutenant Commander was staring at Danny with an expression that mixed horror and admiration. "The cannot be eaten," said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "Its flesh is toxic to most species. Its blood contains acid that burns organic tissue. Its bones are harder than most metals. No species in the galaxy has ever consumed meat." Danny stood up and brushed off his knees. He looked at the massive, deadly creature. He looked at the towering warriors. He looked at his own hands, which had cuts and burns from decades of working in kitchens. Then he smiled. "Nobody has ever eaten one?" he asked. "Never confirmed. The most dangerous predator in 3 star systems, and nobody has ever figured out how to cook it. It is impossible." Danny Vega's smile grew wider. In that moment, he was not thinking about diplomacy or trade agreements or relations. He was thinking about his grandmother, who had taught him that any ingredient could become a meal if you understood it well enough. He was thinking about every challenge he had ever faced in a kitchen, every impossible dish he had been told could not be made. "That," Danny said quietly, "sounds like a challenge." The silence in the negotiation chamber stretched out for a long moment. Stood completely still, his 4 arms hanging at his sides, his yellow eyes fixed on the small human who had just said something impossible. The other looked at each other with expressions that their faces had probably never made before. "You wish to cook the," said. It was not a question. He was repeating the words as if trying to make sense of them. "If you're willing to let me try," Danny replied. "It seems wrong to waste such a magnificent animal, and honestly, I'm curious. I've never worked with anything like this before." Ambassador Price recognized an opportunity when she saw one. She had been a diplomat for 20 years, and she understood that sometimes the best negotiations happened in unexpected ways. She stepped forward, her voice calm and professional. "In human culture, the preparation and sharing of a hunted creature is considered one of our highest honors," she explained. "Chef Vega is one of our finest culinary artists. Perhaps a demonstration would help establish a foundation of mutual respect between our species." Turned his attention to the ambassador. "You want us to watch your human fail, to watch him poison himself trying to do what no species has ever accomplished." "I want you to watch him try," Price said, "and then we can discuss trade agreements as equals, whatever happens." The leader was quiet for a moment. Danny could see him thinking, calculating. The original plan had clearly been to intimidate the humans into accepting unfavorable terms. But this human had refused to be intimidated. Instead, he had turned the display of power into something else entirely. "If your cook dies, your people will not blame us?" finally asked. "Danny," Ambassador Price turned to him, "you understand what you're proposing?" Danny looked at the again. It had stopped thrashing and was watching him with what he could have sworn was curiosity. Or perhaps it was sizing him up as a potential meal. Hard to tell with alien predators. "I understand," Danny said, "and I volunteer freely. No blame to anyone if things go wrong." Made that rumbling sound again, the one that might have been laughter. "Very well, little human. You have 3 days. If you can make the edible, we will consider it a gesture of respect worthy of discussion. If you fail, we will remember that humans are as foolish as they are weak." The deal was struck. Word spread through Station Omega-7 within hours. By the end of the first day, beings from across the station were talking about the crazy human who thought he could cook the. Danny spent that first day gathering information. He talked to the stations, who told him everything they knew about biology. The news was not encouraging. "The toxic compounds are distributed throughout the muscle tissue," explained a scientist named Dr. Kell, a tall, blue-skinned being with 6 eyes. "It's not like an earth pufferfish, where the poison is concentrated in certain organs. Every part of thee is dangerous." "What about heat?" Danny asked. "Do the toxins break down at high temperatures?" "Theoretically, yes. But the temperatures required would turn the meat into something like charcoal. You would be eating ash, not food." Danny wrote notes in a small book he carried everywhere. What about the blood, the acid content? Extremely corrosive. It will eat through most materials within minutes. We're not even sure how the creature's own body contains it. And the bones? Denser than titanium. You would need industrial equipment just to cut through them. By the end of the conversation, Danny had filled 10 pages with notes. They looked at him with something like pity. You understand this is impossible, yes. They are not exaggerating. No species has ever eaten meat because no species can eat meat. Danny smiled and closed his notebook. Thank you for your help. This is exactly what I needed. He spent the second day requisitioning equipment. The station master was confused by his requests but granted them anyway. The humans were paying good money for their docking fees, and if they wanted to waste resources on a fool's errand, that was their business. Danny requested acid-resistant gloves made from synthetic materials. He requested a plasma torch capable of precise temperature control. He requested a centrifuge for separating chemical compounds. He requested vacuum chambers and pressure cookers and filtration systems, and a dozen other pieces of equipment that seemed to have nothing to do with cooking. He also requested his spice collection from the Endurance. It was a wooden box that had belonged to his grandmother, filled with bottles and jars accumulated over generations. Some of the spices were common. Some were rare. A few were so old that nobody remembered exactly where they had come from. Lieutenant Commander visited him that evening in the temporary kitchen space the station had provided. Danny was surrounded by equipment and papers, looking more like a scientist than a chef. "You know everyone thinks you're going to die, right?" said, leaning against the doorframe. "I know," Danny replied without looking up from his calculations. "The betting pools have odds of about 5,000 to 1 against you surviving." "That seems low." Laughed despite herself. "Danny, I'm serious. You don't have to do this. The ambassador can find another way to handle the—" Danny finally looked up. His eyes were tired but excited, the way they always got when he was working on something challenging. "Do you know why I became a cook?" "Because you love food." "Because my grandmother told me that cooking is how humans show they care about each other. When you make a meal for someone, you're giving them a piece of yourself. You're saying that their hunger matters to you, that their pleasure matters to you, that they matter to you." He gestured at the equipment around him. They came here to show us they're stronger than us. They wanted to make us feel small. But strength isn't just about killing things. It's about what you do after. It's about taking something dangerous and making it nourishing. It's about turning death into life. Was quiet for a moment. "That's beautiful, Danny. It's also insane." "Probably," he agreed. "But my grandmother also told me that the best meals are the ones that seem impossible until someone makes them." He picked up a piece of equipment and examined it carefully. "The is impossible. That's exactly why I have to try." On the morning of the third day, Danny Vega stood in front of the dead and prepared to do something no one had ever done before. The creature had been killed humanely the night before, its massive body now laid out on a reinforced table. Representatives from dozens of species had gathered to watch. They stood in the front row, their expressions unreadable. Danny put on his acid-resistant gloves. He picked up his plasma torch. He took a deep breath. Then he began to cook. The observation gallery above the kitchen was packed with over 200 beings from 40 different species. They pressed against the transparent walls, trying to get a better view of the human below. Some had traveled from other parts of the station, just to witness what they were certain would be a spectacular failure. Others had come hopping to see something they could not explain. Danny Vega ignored them all. He had learned long ago that the only way to do difficult work was to forget about the audience and focus on the task. Right now, his entire world was the massive creature laid out before him. The first challenge was the blood. Dr. Kell had been right about its corrosive properties. Even through his acid-resistant gloves, Danny could feel heat where small drops touched the material. He worked carefully, using the plasma torch to cauterize blood vessels as he made his incisions. It was slow, precise work that required complete concentration. 3 hours into the process, Danny had managed to drain most of the blood into specialized containers. The containers hissed and smoked as the acid ate at their inner linings, but they held. Danny had chosen materials that could withstand the corrosion long enough for him to work. Next came the skin. The armored plates were indeed harder than most metals, but Danny had noticed something in his research that others had missed. The plates were not attached directly to the muscle. There was a thin layer of connective tissue between them, softer and more vulnerable. He used his plasma torch at its lowest setting, carefully cutting through this layer without damaging the meat beneath. It took another 4 hours to remove the armor. By the end, Danny's arms were shaking from the effort of maintaining such precise control. Sweat soaked through his clothes, but the skin came away in sections, revealing the muscle beneath. The meat was strange. It had a dark purple color, almost black in places, with veins of silver running through it like threads of metal. When Danny touched it with a probe, he could feel it twitching slightly, residual nerve impulses still firing even hours after death. The muscle tissue is still active, he said to himself, making notes. That's how they store energy for their attacks. The cells don't die the same way Earth animal cells do. This was a problem. Active tissue meant active toxins. He needed to neutralize the poison without destroying the meat. Danny spent an hour testing different approaches on small samples. High heat turned the meat to ash, just as Dr. Kell had predicted. Chemical neutralizers changed the flavor to something bitter and unpleasant. Freezing seemed to slow the activity but did not stop it. Then he remembered something his grandmother had told him about cooking snake meat. Some snakes had mild toxins in their flesh that could make people sick if prepared wrong. The key was not to destroy the toxins, but to transform them through slow, sustained heat at exactly the right temperature. He ran calculations on his data pad, comparing Earth biochemistry to what he knew about biology. The numbers suggested there might be a temperature window, a range where the toxins would break down into harmless compounds without the meat being destroyed. The window was narrow, very narrow. He would need to maintain temperatures within a range of about 5 degrees for several hours. Any hotter and the meat would burn. Any cooler and the toxins would remain active. Danny had never attempted anything so precise in his life. He had no guarantee it would work, but he had no better ideas, so he began. The station's industrial kitchen had equipment designed for dozens of different species, including some that required extremely precise temperature control for religious or biological reasons. Danny calibrated the cooking chamber to his specifications, checked the readings 3 times, and placed the first piece of meat inside. Then he waited. The observation gallery had grown quiet. Many of the watchers had expected the human to fail quickly, dramatically, possibly explosively. Instead, they were watching him stand in front of a cooking chamber, occasionally adjusting controls, for hours on end. "Is he doing anything?" one observer asked. "He's waiting," another replied. "Humans do that sometimes, they wait." Danny did not move from his position. He watched the temperature readings like they were the most important thing in the universe. When they drifted up by half a degree, he adjusted. When they drifted down, he adjusted. He did not eat. He did not sit down. He barely blinked. 6 hours passed. Lieutenant Commander brought him water, which he drank without taking his eyes off the chamber. Ambassador Price stopped by to check on his progress, and he answered her questions with single words, his attention never wavering. 8 hours. The meat inside the chamber had changed color. The dark purple was fading to something lighter, almost pink. The silver veins had disappeared completely, and the twitching had stopped. Danny opened the chamber and used a specialized probe to test the meat. The readings showed trace amounts of the original compounds, but at levels that should be safe for consumption. Should be. There was only one way to know for sure. He cut a small piece from the sample. It was warm and tender, falling apart easily under his knife. He lifted it toward his mouth. "Wait!" shouted from the observation gallery. Danny looked up at her. His expression was calm. "If this kills me, tell my grandmother her recipes saved the world," he said. Then he ate the piece of meat. The observation gallery held its breath. They leaned forward, their yellow eyes wide. Ambassador Price gripped the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. Danny chewed slowly, thoughtfully, the way he always did when tasting something for the first time. He swallowed. Nothing happened. He waited 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. His body showed no signs of distress. No burning, no convulsions, no symptoms of poisoning. A smile spread across his face, the smile of a man who had just accomplished the impossible. "It needs seasoning," he announced, "but the base is good. The texture is similar to slow-cooked beef but with a richer flavor, almost sweet." He began to work faster now, processing the rest of the meat through his temperature-controlled cooking process. The toxic blood he had collected earlier, he discovered, could be neutralized and reduced into a sauce with remarkable depth of flavor. The bones, when subjected to sustained pressure and heat, could be made into a stock that added complexity to every dish it touched. His grandmother's spices came out of their box. Cumin and coriander and paprika, flavors of earth that had never been combined with anything like meat before. Danny worked by instinct now, adding and adjusting and tasting, building something entirely new from ingredients that should not have been possible. 12 hours after he began, Danny Vega stepped back from his work and looked at what he had created. Multiple dishes, each designed to showcase a different aspect of the transformed flesh. Each dish adjusted for the biology of different species who might want to taste it. His arms were covered in bandages where the residual nerve responses had triggered defensive spines during the butchering process. His face was red from working over hot surfaces for hours without rest. His apron had been replaced 3 times after being destroyed by acid splashes. But he was done, and he was smiling. "The feast is ready," he announced to the observation gallery. "Who's hungry?" The main dining hall of Station Omega-7 had been transformed. Tables had been arranged in a wide circle, with seats for over 100 guests from dozens of species. At the center of the circle stood Danny Vega, surrounded by serving stations loaded with covered dishes. The aroma that filled the room was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. The delegation sat at the position of honor directly facing the human chef, had not spoken since Danny emerged from the kitchen. His yellow eyes had not left Danny's face. The other warriors shifted in their seats, uncomfortable in a way they had probably never been before. They were predators. They understood hunting and killing and dominance. They did not understand what they were witnessing. Ambassador Price sat with the rest of the human delegation. Her formal diplomatic robes were still pristine, but there were dark circles under her eyes. She had not slept while Danny worked, unable to tear herself away from the observation gallery. Now she watched with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Danny cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "In my culture," he began, his voice tired but strong, "we have a tradition. When a great hunt is completed, when a difficult prey is finally taken, the hunters do not simply eat alone. They share. The meal becomes a way of honoring the animal, of thanking it for giving its life, of connecting everyone who eats it together in a single experience." He lifted the cover from the first serving station. The smell intensified, rich and complex, and somehow both alien and familiar at the same time. There was a magnificent creature. It took the lives of 3 hunters before it was captured. It was designed by evolution to be impossible to consume, a predator so dangerous that even in death it could kill anything that tried to eat it. Danny smiled. But nothing is truly impossible. It just requires patience, understanding, and the willingness to try. He began to serve. Each dish was presented with care, with explanation, with obvious love for the work that had gone into creating it. The main course was sliced meat, slow-cooked in its own transformed juices, seasoned with earth spices that complemented its natural sweetness. Side dishes used different parts of the creature, each prepared differently, each showcasing a new aspect of what could become when approached with respect and creativity. Danny had prepared the meat rare, barely cooked beyond the safety threshold, honoring their preference for food that still tasted of the hunt. For the herbivorous species present, he had created a sauce derived from the creature's fat that could be used on their own traditional dishes, allowing them to participate without violating their dietary needs. For the humans, he had prepared the meat in a style that reminded him of his grandmother's cooking, familiar yet transformed by alien ingredients. Was the first to eat. The leader lifted a piece of meat with his lower right hand. He examined it closely, turning it in the light. Then, without ceremony, he put it in his mouth. His forearms went still. His breathing stopped. His yellow eyes, which had been narrow with suspicion, slowly widened. "This," said quietly, his deep voice barely above a whisper, "is the finest thing I have ever consumed." The words broke something in the room. The other began to eat, and their reactions echoed their leaders. Sounds of satisfaction rumbled from their throats. Warriors who had faced death countless times closed their eyes in something like peace. One by one, the other species began to taste what Danny had prepared. The reactions varied based on biology and culture, but the underlying response was universal. Something impossible had been made not just possible but extraordinary. Ambassador Price leaned over to Lieutenant Commander. "I think the negotiations just got a lot easier." Nodded, watching Danny move through the room, checking on guests, adjusting portions, making sure everyone had exactly what they needed. He looked exhausted but radiant. This was his element. This was who he was. Stood and walked to where Danny was working. The towered over the human, his massive form blocking out the light. Danny looked up without fear. "You have done something that my people have never accomplished in 10,000 years of hunting," said. "We have killed them. We have mounted their heads as trophies. We have used their bones for weapons, but we have never thought to eat them. We considered them too dangerous, too powerful, too other." The leader extended one of his four hands toward Danny. In culture, Danny had learned, this was a gesture of profound respect, offered only to those considered true equals. "You looked at the most dangerous predator in 3 systems," continued, "and you saw not a threat but an opportunity, not an enemy but an ingredient. You are not what we were told humans were. You are something else entirely." Danny took the offered hand. His small human fingers disappeared in this grip, but the handshake was gentle, careful, conscious of the difference in their strength. "We are what we've always been," Danny said. "We're just better at hiding it than people expect." The feast continued for hours. As the food was consumed, conversations began. Warriors talked with human security officers about hunting techniques. Herbivorous diplomats discussed trade agreements with their carnivorous counterparts. Species that had barely spoken to each other found common ground over shared plates. Near the end of the evening, Ambassador Price found Danny sitting alone in a corner, finally eating his own portion of the meal. He looked like he might fall asleep at any moment, but he was still smiling. "You realize you just changed everything, right?" Price said, sitting down across from him. Danny shrugged. "I just cooked dinner." "You cooked the impossible. They are offering us trade terms we never would have gotten through conventional negotiation. Other species are asking if they can send their own cooks to train with humans. There's already talk of establishing a human culinary academy here on the station." "That sounds nice," Danny said through a mouthful of meat. Price laughed. I'm writing my report to Earth tonight. I'm recommending that we expand our cultural exchange programs with particular emphasis on culinary arts. I think a single, well-prepared meal might accomplish more than 1,000 warships. Danny nodded slowly, thinking about that. My grandmother used to say that you can learn everything you need to know about a species by how they treat food, whether they share it or hoard it, whether they create with it or just consume it, whether they see it as fuel or as art. What do you think the galaxy learned about humans tonight? Danny finished his meal and set down his utensils. He looked out at the dining hall, where hundreds of beings from across the galaxy were still talking and laughing and sharing the food he had made. I think they learned that we never stop being predators, he said quietly. We just found a better way to express it. We don't just kill things, we transform them. We take something dangerous and make it nourishing. We take something that could hurt us and turn it into something that brings people together. He stood up, swaying slightly from exhaustion, appeared at his side, ready to help him back to the Endurance. We're not less dangerous than Danny added. We're more dangerous, because we've had thousands of years to practice turning our hunting instincts into something constructive. They see a predator and think trophy. We see a predator and think dinner party. In the years that followed, human chefs became the most sought-after professionals in the galaxy. They opened restaurants on space stations and alien. They consulted for governments struggling with food security. They transformed relations one impossible dish at a time. And it all started because a short-order cook from New Mexico looked at the galaxy's most dangerous predator and thought, I bet I could work with that. Danny Vega retired eventually, after training 3 generations of human chefs who spread across the stars, carrying his techniques and his philosophy. He returned to Earth, to Albuquerque, to the house where his grandmother had first taught him that cooking was love made visible. Sometimes, late at night, he would receive messages from former students working in distant systems. They would tell him about new challenges, new ingredients, new impossible creatures that everyone said could not be eaten. And Danny would smile and write back the same thing every time. Nothing is impossible, it just hasn't been done yet. Now go make something delicious. The galaxy had thought humans feared meat. They had been wrong about that. They had been wrong about a lot of things, but they were learning. One meal at a time, they were learning what humanity had always known. The most dangerous predator is not the one that kills. It is the one that transforms.